It's a great pleasure to meet with you. We were chatting a little bit, but decided to hit the record button because the horses left the barn, and we just want to make sure that we capture this whole thing. This is our
Yeah.
first time face-to-face meeting, and it's a great pleasure of mine. We've talked a bit by phone, and we've been emailing back and forth for the last several months. And so this is an auspicious moment to be having this conversation. I'm open to talking about anything and everything. And just to let the audience know, tomorrow I will be heading in for chemo session, starting my chemotherapy treatment for pancreatic cancer. And such as it is, I mean, you can't know what life has in store for you, but my spirits are good, and I figured, what better time to have a conversation digging into old world history, but the eve of my healing journey.
Yes.
So, Lou, absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Amen,
Thank you
brother.
for joining me.
You're welcome. Yeah, as I said, I stumbled upon Marvelous Old World, I don't know, a few months back, and you were hitting on HH Richardson, and that hit something in me because I've been onto this guy for a while. So that's what prompted me to send you a message and to say, hey, I'd love to talk to you a little bit further. So again, it's an honor to be here to talk to you, and let's get to it.
Well, you mentioned to me, by way of background, that you are a retired police detective. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I did almost 30 years in law enforcement, and I did my last 5. I did with the FBI Terrorism Task Force, and then I ended up retiring in 2021. At the time, I thought I would just, be golfing and doing what retired people do,
Mm-hmm.
and then the COVID thing hit, and I had some training in masking, so I was trying to enlighten some of the school boards as to the limits of masking, based on what I knew.
Right.
And
Based on some experience.
based on some experience, but their science trumped mine. They didn't want to hear it. So at that point, I started to question things a little bit more. And I had always been questioning things as it was. But when I saw that was kind of a house of cards that just had to tumble down, I started looking at other things. And sure enough, there's rabbit holes everywhere that I was jumping into. But one of them that really intrigued me was the architectural thing. So I moved on from the COVID stuff, and I started looking at other things, and I started looking literally, this goes back 10 years ago. I was looking at buildings in my own town.
And where was that?
This is in Western Massachusetts, in a town called Ludlow. And we have these giant mill factories, and we have 350 mill houses and a library and a hospital and a high school that were all built, as they say, within 20 years in the magic period of 1880 to 1900.
Right.
And we're talking 5-story mill buildings with wood flooring, 5 stories. And what they did was they produced jute, which is they produced the canvas bags that the postal carriers would carry. But it didn't make sense when the town population was 1,200 people. And every other town in our area, we have a Holyoke, which is filled with paper mills, Springfield, Massachusetts, which was developing. So it wasn't like we were pulling workers from other communities to build these giant buildings. And you build 350 mill houses in a span of 10 years, you wonder where they got the manpower to do so. And of course, we all know what they had for equipment back then. It was extremely limited. So that always was in the back of my mind. And then eventually, when I retired, I really jumped into the research as far as structures in my town. And of course, the library is credited to HH Richardson, our little town library. And eventually we'll get to some pictures, and I'll show you what that looks like. And then I just really dug into HH Richardson, and then of course it led to Olmsted. And there's, in the next town over, there's a little park called Olmsted Park, and you wouldn't think twice, because I think anybody could have designed the park that's over there. There's really nothing there. It's a square park. And then I find out that both of them had something to do with UMass Amherst campus, Smith College campus, Mount Holyoke. I mean, you name these campuses, these two guys connected, and apparently they pretty much did everything. And I don't know how they did it, and I actually don't believe they did, which brings us to where we are today, to discuss a little deeper.
Yeah, they did everything everywhere.
It boggles the mind, because as you as an architect, I think the three most important things you do are you plan, you design, and I believe you supervise. And what I wanted to focus on today was I had the opportunity to go to the Capitol building in Albany, New York. And it's one thing to see photos, and it's one thing to have someone explain to you what's there. But when you actually go there and you immerse yourself in the building and in the structure, and you look around, I honestly don't know how they did it. And I don't believe the official narrative. And it goes so deep, and the questions that you have, they can't be answered. I don't know how anyone can answer the questions that I have, and especially what I'm getting at is we're talking sandstone columns and giant blocks. And how did they get these blocks there? Apparently, they came from Scotland, and the 1870s and 1880s. These were shipped over the ocean in wooden hull ships. And I don't know, I watched a video the other day of these older gentlemen in Maine using derricks to move blocks, and it was taking them an hour to move a block 15 feet. So, when you look at the mass of this structure and the handwork and the precision that went into building this thing, it defies logic. And I know you as an architect, I think I've sent you some of the pictures, and I think you described it as an angelic, some angels had to build this thing. So yeah, that's where I focused on that building, and then I focused on a few of his other buildings. And then at some point, I started digging deeper into like antiquities. And I think we had mentioned something about the Masons, and there was a General Morgan, or he was a military guy up in New York. And he started to expose the fact that they took credit. People are taking credit for things they didn't do. And I'm not saying that's the fact here, but I'm saying it's certainly worth asking that question, because the official narrative is almost impossible to believe, considering the bulk of work that he did at the same time. I mean, literally across the street from the Albany State Capital is an immense, beautiful city hall. And it was built so as he's designing the Albany State Capital, this building across the street is going up, and that building in and of itself is a work of art.
Right. You mentioned something in your first email to me about the Trivium method.
Yes.
You want to talk about that a little bit? Because I really think that you nailed it with that. And I hadn't put that together, even though I have the Trivium books on my shelf behind me. But yeah, go ahead and.
Okay. So even going back to the police academy, the first thing you're taught is the who, what, when, where, why, how. So when you're conducting a criminal investigation, and I kind of, when I look at these things, this is how I look at the Albany State Capital, and I'll treat it as though it's a criminal investigation. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. And the how is obviously the hardest piece. But when you have a murder or a homicide, those are the pieces you need to get to put together. You need to build probable cause, and you need to present this to a grand jury and eventually take this thing to court. Now, if this were a court case and you're trying to tell me the official narrative of the Albany State Capital or nearly anything else HH Richardson has done, you're going to have a hard time proving that in a court of law. So with the Trivium, which is grammar, logic, and rhetoric, we start with the grammar, the who, what, when. So we know who, it's HH Richardson, and a few other architects were credited with that building. But for the most part, he gets the credit for the best stuff there, like the Western Staircase, things like that. So when I get to the why, I don't have answers, but I have a lot of viable questions. And I don't know if they have the answer. So when you apply the Trivium to his career, to these buildings, you may get the who, what, and when, maybe, But it's nothing conclusive. And that's the thing with this historical record. I have a lot of questions. And there's a lot of videos I've watched of, academia. These professors will come out and they'll tell you the same story. Well, he was one of the Trinity. It was Sullivan. It was Frank Lloyd Wright, and it was HH Richardson. You hear that over and over. And then he met up with Olmsted, and they developed a relationship. But I never hear any critical analysis, like how.
Yeah.
So the how to me is the most important thing. And for example, when you talk about the sandstone, apparently it came from Scotland. How? How do they do this? How did they coordinate this? And then if you go on a modern shipping website now and you look at what it takes to move stone in large quantities, heavy stone, logistically, it is extremely expensive and extremely difficult, even for modern equipment. So we're talking 1870, 1880. They had to cross the Atlantic.
Yeah.
They had to come up the Hudson River. They had to trek this stuff up the hill to where they were building this place.
Yeah.
And it's astonishing to me. And again, I don't have the answers, Matthew, but I have the questions. I'm not so sure if they can't be answered, then how do we rely on this official narrative as being truth? So that's where I'm stuck. But I think applying the trivium to this whole realm of research is very beneficial for whoever's conducting the research.
Yeah,
it's been rewarding for me.
I absolutely. I'm completely on board with that approach, and I hadn't plugged in the trivium interrogation piece, but the critical thought process that I was going with is that, and I've said this many times, is that stones don't lie, and the textbooks can say anything they want. The history books, you can write. It's a lot easier to put ink on paper, and to project that out into the world than it is to actually design, engineer, and execute a large-scale building project. And so for me, it was much more important looking at it through the lens of somebody who has 30 years of building experience and architecture experience. I've been on both sides of it. I've worked with engineers, structural engineers for decades, and I know what goes into it. And there's these major gaps. The how, and you're in Massachusetts. I'm out here in Seattle, and I often thought, because I actually was raised in New Jersey, and I got my architectural education in Newark at NJIT, and that city is 350 years old at least. And I often thought, once I started getting into this research, that it would be really, really difficult to discern and to tease apart what came before what and when, and it's just a big kind of mash of cultures and waves of immigration and developments of technology, and there's centuries to tease apart. Whereas Seattle, we had modern photography when Seattle was in its infancy, and so we can go back and look at the record. And that's what I started to do. I started to apply these questions to Seattle, and what I came up with was, there's just no way,
Right.
just and briefly. And I've got a lot of videos on the Seattle question, but just the idea that these old cities, and this story repeats itself over and over again all throughout the country and outside of our country, up into Canada, and Australia has similar stories about cities that were just basically built out of matchsticks on the frontier. And then in the late 1800s, thereabout early 1900s, they burned down because they were just waiting to burn down. We hadn't had modern fire prevention codes and so forth. They were just wood shanty towns that were waiting to go up in smoke, and they did. And then we rebuilt them, and isn't the city better for it? And I started looking at the photographs of the fire destruction in Seattle in 1889, and looking at ruins of brick and stone ornate masonry buildings with walls that are feet thick of like finely carved stonework and and then realizing that there was the earlier iteration of the city before the new city was rolled out on top of it was exquisite, and it certainly wasn't just built out of lumber. And again, that story repeats itself over and over again. So again, the storybooks can say anything that they want, but when I see photographs like that and examine that kind of evidence through the lens of a builder, it just doesn't add up. And then I came across this book, Hidden Corner, which is about the Northwest, and it's this Distant Corner. I've talked about this book a lot.
Yes.
Jeffrey Oxner. He's still an architectural history professor at the University of Washington, and he did a great service to at least to this researcher and to the research community, because this book is about the legacy of HH Richardson in Seattle.
Wow.
And he goes building by building and does his best to make sense with the narrative that is accepted. We call the mainstream narrative, the academic canon, if you will. And he goes building by building and tries to put the early buildings of Seattle in the context of the work that HH Richardson is credited with doing as I don't want to say inevitable growth, but as just an outgrowth of that legacy.
Sure.
And so when I started reading through it, and with already this sort of suspicion that I had that this doesn't add up, then I started to really dial in on it. And then of course that led me to HH Richardson, who was my hero as an architecture student and a young architect. I mean, he was the guy. He's a titan of American architecture. And what's so hard about this for me is that people only get into Richardson if they really care about architecture.
Right.
And so now I'm going at it with the idea of dismantling. That's probably not the right word, but questioning, I say,
yeah,
maybe questioning his legacy, and trying to maybe this will be more clear as we proceed, but because it's delicate, because I, having gone through a formal architecture education, when I talk about this gentleman, Jeffrey Oxner, I imagine that I'm talking to my favorite professor.
Right.
Because this guy really is into architectural history, and I love that. And he's into American history, and he's into how did the cities develop, and it's just been I started a master's degree in infrastructure planning as well. And we apply, and maybe this is where I get a lot of the sensibility from, is we really looked at Newark hard with a lens of the transportation, infrastructure, development, and historical lens, and trying to peeling back the layers of historical development. And I can just imagine trying to poke these kind of holes in a conversation with somebody who's devoted their life and their career to this pursuit. So I don't take any of this lightly. I want to be precise, and I want to be right, which is why I got so excited when you reached out to me, that you were doing the same thing. And I'm really impressed that it seems to me that you intuited that there's something really off, and you started to investigate it completely independently, and started and coming up with very similar conclusions.
And it's not that I'm looking to discredit his legacy at all. I'm just asking questions that I think are viable questions, logistical questions, and just how. And again, we get back to that how. And I'm not so sure there's an answer for how certain things were done, how you accomplish this much in really a short period of time. He died at 47 years old. He wasn't healthy, as we all know. But that's an incredible accomplishment for anyone who lives 100 years, never mind the short, span of time that he was on this earth. But I think it speaks beyond HH Richardson. I think there's a lot of questions about history that I have.
Yeah.
Heck, even in the state capitol, they have 77 faces carved into these stones. Some of them are famous people. Some of them are relatives of the sculptors. But then there's Abner Doubleday, and Abner Doubleday gets credit for inventing baseball. And now you do a Wikipedia search and you find out he had nothing to do with it.
He
Yet
also is credited with, isn't he credited with the first shot of the Civil
first shot
War?
at Fort Sumter. Yes.
I mean,
There's a lot of that going on. In New York, seemed to be a lot of people in upstate New York who had very successful careers in many different areas. But yeah, he gets credited with baseball, which apparently now is not true. Yet we still have Cooperstown, his hometown, and it's Doubleday Field. So there's aspects of history we've always been taught, but somehow now we're finding out some of those things are not true. So I think it's fair for us to question things. And a lot of history is hearsay. And what's hearsay in a court of law? Well, it's inadmissible. You cannot use it. So there's a lot of things in history that we just need to be, I guess, we take for granted. We're taught that Christopher Columbus, then it became Leif Erikson and then became who knows who. But there's a lot of history that changes over time. And how does that change? I don't know, but it does. And I think it's fair to ask these questions that we're asking. And I'm not trying to insult anyone. I'm not trying to say, I don't believe he did anything. I'm just trying to find out the how again.
Yeah.
And I think we both come to that conclusion. And again, when you go to these places and you look at these structures, I mean, my jaw hit the floor when I walked into that building. I could not believe it's as though you could be in Rome or you could be in Europe somewhere, and you're in this building that was apparently built right after the Civil War. State of New York, I think, had the most, gave the most men up to the Civil War. So we're talking right after the Civil War, we had the gumption and energy to build this castle. And then, other buildings there were built in the same way. That building is not by itself. And that just leads to more questions.
Right.
And we can't cross-examine anyone because there's no one around to tell us, yeah, this is what I did. This is when we did it. So we have to rely on the historical record.
Right.
And to me, there's a lot of holes in that record.
Well, there was the historical record. I mean, back to this Distant Corner book, and my wife challenges me constantly to go to primary sources because she's got a PhD. So I'm trying to.
Yeah, you have to.
Well, look at it. And she says, well, where'd you get that information from? Like, oh, okay, I'll go back and research more. But so Oxner in this book constantly refers to newspaper accounts.
Yes.
And over and over and over again, he says there's really no record except for these newspaper accounts. And it's like, who owns the newspaper? Well, in Seattle was Henry Yesler, who supposedly founded Seattle, but he also owned the Seattle PI. And the Seattle PI headquarters, burned down in the Great Fire of 1889. But somehow magically they came out with a print copy telling all about the fire the very next day. And if you're going to have the historical record rely on newspaper accounts, we've got a major problem. And the other thing that I've been finding is that I've got probably 8 books here that I've been reading on Richardson. They all contradict each other.
I found that as well.
They're all in contradiction. And I read one and I'm like, what, I must be crazy. This is so convincing. So for instance, I want to show you this one. This is the first biography of HH Richardson. This is from 1888, right? 2 years after he died. This book came out.
On the cover.
Yeah, that's the New York Statehouse.
Yeah.
And this is 1888, but I also found an article from the Atlantic magazine in 1886. And point by point, it's in complete contradiction with the narrative that's in that book. And we can get into the details on that because it's a lot of fun. I sat up last night. I just, you know, after my wife fell asleep, and I just wrote pages of, just off the top of my head, pages of where the story in from one source is in conflict with the way the story is told in another source. So, and I've also been talking about our narrative as like a fabric, and you can kind of go mad pulling on threads, and it's like, well, this doesn't
Absolutely.
make sense, and that doesn't make sense, and this isn't contradiction, and it can make you a little bit crazy until you realize this is all a fabric, and it's overlaid
Absolutely.
our reality and our whole lives, and we've been living with this and swimming in that soup, and it's pulling apart really quick right now, and that's okay.
Absolutely.
That's part of what
Totally
this
agree.
time represents.
I totally agree with that. I did want to get into something you mentioned, newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I ended up finding this thing called Raftsman's Journal. It was out of Clearfield, Pennsylvania. This thing was written in, I believe, it was 1865. So we're talking 5 years prior to the building of the State House
Mm-hmm.
in Albany. So there's an interesting paragraph, and it says, now again, this was written, I don't know who the author was, but it was written in this newspaper in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. So strange as it may appear, America abounds in antiquities so extensive, so beautiful and majestic as to rival those of Thebes and Nineveh. Ruins of ancient cities of immense extent, fortifications, mounds, and pyramids, temples with walls built of hewn stone showing a refined taste in architecture and adorned with human figures beautifully executed. So that alone, it perfectly describes the State House that hadn't been built yet.
Right.
So the argument is, was that building there previously? And is this something that was already known? So there's some interesting artifacts in these newspapers that predate some of these buildings, yet make reference to them. So I don't know specifically what he was talking about there or who the author was speaking of, but that's an interesting find, and it's a telling find as far as I'm concerned.
And I've looked at curious little bits of the historical account where Richardson wasn't considered the initial architect. What I read is that the building had already been in production, and somehow the project was going off the rails.
Yes.
And so he was brought in, he and another architect who I can't recall right now, were brought in to salvage the project, and they made it seem like it was a bit of a disaster. But when you look at that building, and you've pointed this out in your emails and when we talked over the phone, that it's just so precise. Like,
It
I don't
is.
understand. Like, you look at the interiors and there's no error. So that doesn't jive with the idea that it was a mess of a project and had to be salvaged by this genius architecture team.
Yeah, there was an architect prior to, and I believe he was from Canada, but the story is he had two walls put up and it was going so slow that they just fired him and then they moved on to somebody else. But even the tour guides can't get it straight because I've already gone through two, and it was, well, it took 12 years for them to make the Great Western Staircase. And then it was 14 years to make the Great Western Staircase. And they had 18 sculptors that they brought in from Europe.
Right.
Oh, no, they had 12 sculptors that worked for 10 years. So the stories are all over the place. However, when you think again, logistically, when you use the Trivium, how did they find 12 precise sculptors in Europe? Who did the correspondence to reach out to find them? Who convinced them to come across the ocean for 12 years to
Mhm.
carve faces in a building in Albany, New York?
And there's never any records of any of
There
this.
is no record of that. And you cannot find records of any of the sculptors. And then when you look at that work, whoever it was incredibly talented. I mean, I went to art school. At least I knew that much. I studied art and I know what goes into it. There are
Mhm.
no mistakes there. Nothing is off. I mean, I can walk around my house and I'll find disasters everywhere, but This place is, again, it's like angels from heaven came down and just designed this beautiful building. And I have, I do have photos I can show you, but when you're there and you walk, and it's not when they say the Western staircase, this is not a staircase. This is just staircase after staircase after staircase going up 4 or 5 stories. And at the top is a giant glass ceiling. It's incredible. And it's the first time, or the first place in New York where they actually had electricity. So now there's these brass light posts up and down the staircase as you go up. So it's a feat of phenomenal engineering and art. It's beautiful. And if anyone can get there, and the other thing is, Matthew, these are everywhere. These buildings are not just, this is just one we're picking on, but they're everywhere. And even in my own town, you can find something that just defies the population. It defies logic, and nobody has answers. All they do is tell you the story, but there's no cross-examining. It's just, this is what happened. This is how it happened. And it's there, and that's the end of it. And when you do question it, sometimes people just like, they don't know, they didn't even think to question it. It's just always been there, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's magical thinking that they're just there, and then we accept that, because it hurts to think about it otherwise. It takes a lot of work. Like, it's not just the design and then the building. You have interface with structural engineer, mechanical engineer, civil engineering. You have to, you have all that planning, the infrastructure development, the excavation, the foundation work. It goes on and on. For just a house, to build a house from start to finish is, design, permitting, regular residential house is an easy 2-year project. When you're talking about these, like, I mean, we should just get into your photos and let me hand it over to you, so we can show folks what we're referring to. But these are years in the making.
The other thing that another question I have, and if this were to go to a trial and you have the people that built this there, I would ask them, why did you import sandstone from Scotland when 100 miles away along the Erie Canal is what's called Medina, New York, and Medina, New York has some of the finest sandstone in the world, and it's many different colors. I think they call it blue sandstone, but it comes in many different colors, including red, which is what the Western staircase is, pretty much red sandstone. I don't understand, if you're building the Capitol building in New York State, why you wouldn't just take sandstone from New York State.
Yeah.
But someone decided to go across the ocean somehow to Scotland. So that's another logistical question that makes no sense to me.
That gets into the cement question.
Yes.
Right. They started importing Portland cement, which was brittle and relatively weak and falls apart after 50, 70 years, versus the cement, the basically Roman cement, but it's American rock cement that comes out of the Catskills, that hardens over time, that hardens underwater, that can last centuries and millennia. And many of what we refer to as the old world buildings in America are made with this cement. And that, to me, is you could go building by building, and if that building is made with this American rock cement, it's probably an old world building. And if it's made with Portland cement, it's probably part of the new iteration of the civilization that we all
unbelievable
grew up under. So let me hand over the screen share to you and show us and these are all photographs that you took
I've
yourself,
taken, yeah.
right?
And that's the other thing. I mean, I didn't want to be just internet research guy. I wanted to get out there in the field. I want to experience the things firsthand. So I'm not just, reading things off of websites and regurgitating things. I do a lot of reading, but I like to, I've gone all over the country in the last couple of years. I've been to Dallas and Denver, and I don't go to party. I go to look at buildings.
Right.
Just, when
it's
you get
one of
older,
the funnest thing to do now. When you go to, I've been traveling for work, and I've found myself in Arizona and Colorado and you know, you just go to these old towns and look around and check out the plaques, and it's, yeah, when was there a great fire?
Exactly.
And all these beautiful buildings were built in 1889. I whatever was going, whatever was in the water in 1888, 1889. And I like to point this out, because if we are crazy, and that
Yep.
story, then the historical record is true, why don't we celebrate that? We had
Yes.
a building renaissance, an architectural renaissance that would have been unrivaled in human history in this country. If all of that happened at the time that they said, why aren't Hollywood movies and novels written about this time in our
Absolutely.
life? It was just before, it wasn't that long ago.
Absolutely.
So that's worth
I
looking at as well.
totally agree.
Let's
All
check out
right.
your photos.
Let's see.
And I want to point out too, as we get into this, there are certain things in common in these biographies about Richardson, and one of them is that he was a pretty lousy architect for the first 10 years. That's
Yeah.
repeated over and over again, is that his earliest work from like 1965, when he got back from Paris, where he went to the École des Beaux-Arts, to the mid 70s, or even up until 78, was just a period of exploration for him architecturally. And he really didn't produce his strong work yet. So that leaves, just for reference, he died in 86. That leaves, we'll be generous and say a good decade where he would have produced his masterworks.
Okay. So here we are with HH Richardson. This is they have a board when you walk in there, and it kind of introduces you to the architect,
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit of the history. But I obviously I took his picture there, and it says he assumed the task of redesigning the western staircase. His grand design initially did not include a skylight. So when you see at the top, I was mentioning a skylight. He eventually, apparently, he added that in at the end. This is the exterior. This would be the east end of the building, and you can see at the bottom there are those archways, and between each archway and above them are those ornate, those beautiful carvings, faces, and I'll show you a few of those as we move along. This is the top of the building, and again, Henry Hudson on the left, and Joseph Brant, who fought against the Americans. He fought for the British, Native American, Native Indian, and again, there's no historical record as to why he's up there, and the tour guides will tell you they have no idea why he's there.
So there's a bust, going back to that for a
Yep.
second. So there's a bust of a Native American leader, presumably Joseph Brant. He
Yes.
fought against the American side for the British, and he's honored alongside Henry Hudson on
Yes.
this building. And the only thing that makes sense to me in regards to that is if the British actually built this building.
That's an intriguing thought, and
Why
he,
else?
he yeah, he's again, they don't have an answer as to why he's up there. Obviously, again, Henry Hudson, he pretty much founded Albany, New York. So he Hudson River, God, it's pretty clear. But why Brant? I have no answer for you.
And I just want to say, like, just this, I mean, this is a vignette. This is just a thumbnail, just a piece of this sprawling edifice, right? And look
Yes.
at how complex. And I'm telling you, they're not building this just on like gumption and intuition. This is all planned out. Every piece of this is designed, is drawn out on paper before it's executed, because whatever's going on up in that multifaceted chimney cap, it's all those loads are coming down, interacting with fireplaces that are probably going all the way down through every single floor and ending up, with its own foundation piece in the basement. And one thing, I'll just point this out, from one of these books, it said about Richardson's approach. It says, where possible, his approach to design is, where possible, he refused to be pinned down to finished preliminary drawings, preferring to work with the growing builder as a sculptor works with clay. Preferring to work with the growing building as a sculptor works with clay. That's not how architects work. And what I find there is they're trying to make sense of the buildings they see and the stories they're told, and the drawing, the compilation of his actual sketches and drawings that is really lax. And it doesn't, the drawings that we have, the record of the drawings we have, do not explain the buildings that are in front of us. And so they twist themselves into pretzels to make it make sense.
I absolutely agree. And I can't find anything, any kind of drawings relative to this. They have a few sketches in some of the boards outside before you get to the staircase, but nothing to that degree. It just doesn't make sense to me. And I totally agree with your analysis. I mean, you look at that, and that is just a little thumbnail of a giant building, but the amount of planning and design that had to go into this has got to be years in the making.
Yeah,
and I don't understand how the architect. Yeah, I mean, and then again, if you're a sculptor and you have questions, and HH Richardson's back in Brookline, Massachusetts, because there's no record of him being there for any period of time, I would think the architect would have to be there 24/7 whenever questions come up. I would assume. I'm not an architect. I'm just having these logical questions.
Well, I'll do you one better. At the time that this building, his involvement with this building started in 1872, he hadn't even made it up to Brookline, Massachusetts. He was still on
New York.
Staten Island. And it said that he didn't even go to his own office, which was in Manhattan, because he was too sick to take the ferry every day. So he just worked out of his house.
Well, it's again, yeah, I mean, we didn't have the internet and we didn't have phones, so no one was calling him on his cell phone to ask, questions. It defies logic.
Yes. So,
But
okay, let's continue.
okay, so this is where I mentioned earlier, between those archways, these are those meticulous carvings. This is again at the base on the eastern side of the building, and they're along each side of a giant staircase.
Mm-hmm. Incredible.
And I think you had made mention of the chain.
Yeah, it looks like there's a chain underneath the bust, and you mentioned that you had told me that this is a full scale bust, that thing is about 5 feet wide, and so that chain looks broken underneath the head, which is very interesting.
Yes. Yep. The next one, this one's, he's lost a piece of his nose, but it says literature there. So I'm not sure who we're looking at, but I mean, just look at that beautiful artistic design.
Every one of these carvings are unique.
Yeah, there's no one alike. They're all different. And then there's I don't know what that is up in between the two pillars at the top there. It almost looks like some sort of alien or something.
Yeah.
So this is on the exterior.
Capitals. The capitals look like woven baskets.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing. And there's a face. Whose face that is, I don't know, but those are everywhere. Also on the interior of the building are these random faces. I'm not sure who that is. Kind of creepy.
People have made comments in some of my previous videos that, oh, no big deal about all this ornate column work because they just ordered these as parts out of a catalog, as if there was a Sears catalog of ornate columns. And I'm sure there was to some extent, but you look at this and, this is exquisite. It's unique. You imagine the form work that would have been required if that capital piece was poured. I mean, that form work was, master craftsman work in and of itself.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, at least I can speak to the inside, is all the faces on the inside, according to the guides that take you around there, they would tell you that those were done by the sculptors. Some of them were family members. They would do their children's faces. I'm not sure why you would allow your sculptors to come in and put their families' faces in a building in another country, whatever. I'm not sure what relevance that is, but
It was like a selfie in the 1800s, maybe.
exactly. And there's again another one. And we have to remember these have been around a long time. They've handled New York winters, and it's amazing how they've stand the test of time. Again, there's another shot at Hudson and Brant, and then you see a couple little statues on each side. And now we're getting to the inside, and this is just one of the photos of the western staircase. And again, it's not a staircase, as you can see. It is just
it's like an MC Escher.
Exactly. Yes. So I mean, you can see the work that went into this, and just
it's mind-boggling. It really is. The flooring.
And that's the other thing. This is a massive hallway, and those pieces that you see in that floor, those are individual pieces. These aren't design sections. Those are just individual pieces of tile, and they're on every floor. This just happens to be one of the hallways. And there, you get a better look.
You would have had to have had a massive team of architects and designers just for the finishes. You would have had a team of dozens. I worked on a school building some years ago in Seattle, and we had 17 people just working on this one building for a few years. And I mean, there was nothing like this level of detail in it. And so again, this is being done at a time where Richardson is working on his own, isolated in his home office on Staten Island, New York. And
apparently in the 1950s, this floor was at some point it was covered, and they uncovered it. So I'm not sure why anyone would cover that, but yeah, it was covered, and apparently they had it uncovered. And the company where they claim the tile came from was from Great Britain, Menton or Mentor Tile Company, and they're still in business. So when they crack one, they can have one shipped out from England. I looked into that company, and it's very interesting. I'm kind of surprised that it looks like the company was more into making sculptures and designs out of ceramics, but apparently they did flooring as well. So that was just an interesting side piece. But yeah, these floors are everywhere. Some of them have beautiful metal trim in the floor, whether it's brass, I'm not sure what it is, but it's a gold metal on all the floors, and it's staggering. It's just amazing. And then you have these outside. These are these beautiful lampposts, and again, someone had to design that.
And this country is coming out of the Civil War.
Yeah.
Like, it was ravaged, it was broken, it was a mess. And somehow we're just pulling this stuff out of our backside and from the ether, and just like it's no problem at all to just
Yeah.
knock out a lamp like that. I mean, there's no expense spared just in crafting that lamp. I mean, look at how exquisite and how ornate that thing is, and how unique and original.
And this is one of many on the exterior. Okay, and this is the we talk about fires. Well, of course, they had a fire there. And where did it hit? It hit the library. And this was sadly, Mr. Abbott was our lone casualty in the fire. But it burned the library. And what my curiosity would be is, was there or any record of the building in that library? And if there was, obviously, it's gone.
So the fire only hit the library?
Predominantly, it was in the library, yeah, in the archives.
Oh,
So
it's the same
it
old
spread to other
story.
areas, but
It's the
um,
same old story.
yeah,
It's like I've asked so many times, why is it always the downtown that burns in these great conflagrations? Well, it's, for one, it's the financial district. And if you want to
yeah,
lay out new pipes and a new infrastructure, but also that's where the records are kept.
right.
So who owns what? I don't know. I
So
guess
that
I guess it's mine.
that was just a side note as far as losing records.
But it's an important one. And there's another thing that are you aware that the federal repository of patents, the United States Patent Office, burned down twice in the 1800s? And these are like grand buildings in DC, not just one time, but several decades later. I think the first one might have been in the 1830s, and the second time was in the 1850s or so. Like the record of who invented what and what technological knowledge we had as a nation up until that point, and two times it burned down.
Yeah, it's that story is repeated over and over and over. But yeah, I did not know that. Wow. So yeah, we're back inside, and again, you're seeing a column on the inside, and I believe the counties of the state are etched into these columns. So there's Delaware County, New York, and Oneonta County. All the counties are etched into this. And then interestingly enough, there are 77 faces etched into that western staircase. And they just added Ruth Bader Ginsburg's a couple of years ago. So she's the 78th. So they're
the notorious RBG.
yeah. And there you go. That's the top that HH added at the end. So I believe you're at the fourth stories. Yeah,
He
there's
added
four.
the atrium,
Yes.
just the lid there.
Yep.
See, I can believe that.
Yep.
Right? There was a building, it needed some rehab, and yeah.
That's certainly believable. And it almost seems like it doesn't fit.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right. Seems like it's out of place, out of time.
so now we're okay. So this is the again, it's just another view. Just beautiful. Okay, so now everyone talks about that great western staircase, but very few know there's a beautiful eastern staircase as well. And this was done by the other architect that was assigned to work on the building, supposedly. But you just look at that precision, and it's again, it's mind-boggling. And I don't know how you even put that on paper and then translate it to an actual piece of work. It's amazing.
Right. Yeah, just cascading stairwells and arches and broken arches and pointed arches, and the wagon wheel with 12 spindles there representing maybe the zodiac, and it just, yeah, or some cymatic pattern, and it just goes on and on. And again, I've said this before too, that the story as it's told really is like a disservice to the craftsmen that executed this work, because it doesn't pay homage to who they were.
Yeah, I mean, again, they say there were 12 to 14 sculptors that were brought here from England and Ireland and Scotland. If if they were, we should know who they are.
Yeah.
There should be a record, their pictures should be somewhere there, to honor them, because that I mean, right there, again, everywhere you turn, there's just something incredible to look at. And I don't know what that represents, but there is some grotesque things there. There are some grotesques on the walls, and it's just incredible stuff. And then you have these detached heads that are in this archway.
Well, that's strange.
Yeah, and this again is the eastern staircase of the building.
Beware all ye who enter.
And then there's some kind of strange winged animal.
Uh-huh.
This is an elevator. It still works, and I can attest to the fact that it is absolutely silent. When these elevator cars are going up and down, you don't hear them. That speaks to the precision.
Right.
And again, you have that tile floor showing up again.
When was Otis? When was the Otis elevator?
Otis, I believe Otis was out of Boston. And to be honest with you, Matthew, I haven't researched who put this elevator in there. But again, I'm standing 10 feet away from it, and you don't even hear the elevator cars making their way up and down. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Right.
And then there's one statement made by, I guess, one of the historians that I was listening to. It said, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was governor, he had, obviously, we know he had polio, but apparently he had his own private elevator put in to the building. And I'm not sure logistically how you put an elevator shaft into an existing building of this type. And it was so that he could get in and out of his office without causing a scene, so that people wouldn't see him in his wheelchair. It was the entryway to this elevator was from a wall inside the governor's office. They cut a hole in the wall and they put an elevator in there. I'm sure that that took a lot of work, but yeah, that's just a side note.
I didn't know he was already in a wheelchair as the governor.
Yeah, that's the story. And they do have some photos of him in the wheelchair in the State House.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. I mean, they had a few presidents go through there that were governor: Grover Cleveland, Teddy Roosevelt, Martin Van Buren, I believe, was the governor as well. So they've had a few presidents serve as governor there.
Mm-hmm.
So okay. So when I had mentioned earlier, this is the library in the town I live in. Now, this isn't HH Richardson is credited with this small library, and the date on this building was 1888. It was completed. So I believe he passed away just before that, if I'm not mistaken.
1886. Yes.
Yeah. So he had drew up the plans for this library. It was completed in 1888. And the interesting part is I have the librarian is going to get me a copy of the original blueprints for this building. And I'd be interesting to see if his name's on it.
That'd be great to look at. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is one of those buildings in my own town that kind of got me on this journey. There you go. That's one of the exteriors. I mean, nothing
Nice.
outrageous, but
Yeah.
again, he's designing this while that other building is being, worked on.
So
Um,
that's 1888, that one.
yeah,
And
this is
so,
1888.
right. And so we went from 1872, where it's just mind boggling, the New York Statehouse. And then I've noticed that a lot of his later works were actually, it seemed like they were in decline. A lot of the houses, at least the design ability, just seemed to go off of a cliff.
It-
Some of
that
the
that I
houses that he's
agree with.
credited with are just a mess
Are we?
aesthetic.
I think we're looking. Are we talking about the Ames?
Yeah, the Ames
The
Lodge.
Ames. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then, strangely enough, and I think you've alluded to it, he built a pyramid out in Wyoming,
Mm-hmm.
middle of nowhere. And I
It's
believe
supposedly
it.
to homage, as an homage to the Ames brothers, who were
Yes.
railroad magnates. And then there's this other one, which is the Ames wholesale store. Now, at the end, let's get back to that one because it's a beautiful building, which has a very curious history where they found out it was it was not an original Richardson, but it was actually a remodel of an existing building. So it's like, well, who
Ah,
did the existing,
interesting.
who did the early building?
Okay. So, I just wanted to hit on this. This building it sits right next to the State House in Albany. This happens to be the Department of Education building
Mm-hmm.
in Albany, New York. I mean, this is, we're going off a little bit. But this is just to give you an idea of the things that were being built in the city of Albany, which is not really that large of a city. But I'm taking pictures of the State House. I turn around and I see this thing. I'm like, oh my God. So again, just incredible stuff.
Yeah, it's really incredible stuff. And if this was in a European city, we'd ooh and ah and take pictures of it and post photos and like really like, wow, look at what they're capable of doing. And we see it around here and it's yeah, there it is, and it's the
Yep.
style, and it's this idea of style that really I think it distorts our perspective of these old world buildings because if it's seen as a style, it's not authentic. And that's like
True.
kind of a mind game that's played on us. And I've fallen into this trap many, many times myself where it's like I don't appreciate what's right in front of me because I just think of it as a copy,
Right.
right,
Right.
of a real thing. But no, you look at this, I'm looking at buildings like this now, I'm like, no, this is the real thing.
Yeah. That's a great point. Okay. So there's the staircase again. Um, but here we go. This is the town hall that sits directly across the street from the state capitol building. And this was built, I want to say, in the mid 1870s. This is an HH Richardson as well. So I guess, he's designing the state house and somebody said, hey, do you mind doing the town hall real quick? I don't know how that works. But again, it's a beautiful, beautiful building. But again, I don't think it competes at all with the Capitol building. Um,
And so there are town halls. There's a website of all the town halls in the United States, state by state, county by county, and it's mind-boggling in and of itself because it's iterations on this theme, and everyone is unique and different, but they're all called Richardsonian Romanesque.
yes,
Right. And so he was supposedly the first one that did these. And so this is 1870 and all the other ones come after. But isn't it interesting that there are town halls all across the United States that are some elaborate, ornate iteration of this building? And so maybe it was Richardson and maybe it wasn't. And, again, it's like the who, back to the question of, well, who did this? And if it wasn't Richardson, then we've got a real mystery on our hands.
um, okay,
Oh,
so
this is that's the Grace Church, right?
that's the Grace Church.
So this is his first
Yes,
commission.
that's
Back
correct.
from Paris, where he studied all of 2 years out of the 6 years that he was hanging out in Paris during the Civil War. He comes back, and because of his connections through the Porcelainian Secret Society at Harvard, he starts getting commissions like this right out of the gate.
Yep.
How?
And then the
How did
next,
this kid at that time, how did the young man have the knowledge, have the wherewithal? I mean, some
it,
of it's a little bit rusticated, let's say, but it's still like it looks like it belongs to a whole legacy of church buildings of its type, of its ilk, that would have been found all over the place in the Northeast.
and this church happens, it's gone now, but it was in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is a town adjacent to where I am. But I thought it was interesting is that design, the window design is similar to the one we saw on the staircase
Sure.
in Albany. But a different architect was responsible for that staircase. But it's this, I believe this may have been his second or third commission. But he did a few buildings in Springfield, Massachusetts as well. And okay, and that's pretty much what I have as far as I did want to get to this is the ceiling. If you look at that woodwork in the Senate chamber of the State House, but apparently this was added much later.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's beautiful work. But what was there was apparently a 56-foot high atrium dome ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
And 10 years after it was built, apparently it was crumbling and falling on the legislators when they were meeting. So they had to tear that down and they put a new ceiling in there. But yeah, I mean, the building itself just is amazing. And again, if anyone had the opportunity to go see this, and sadly, when you get to the bottom, Matthew, you're not going to believe what's at the base. You get to the bottom of the staircase, and across the hall is a Dunkin' Donuts.
Of course.
And I'm
Well,
like, isn't
it's
this
the
just,
East Coast. It's got to be.
yeah.
At
So
least it's not a Starbucks.
no. So that's essentially what I have for the building. But I focused on that one building. I know he's got so many,
Mm-hmm.
but that one there just it spoke to me, and I thought, to me, it would be somebody's life's work to do that. But he did that over and over and over and over, or he's been credited with doing that over and over again. And again, I'm not trying to destroy this man's legacy, but I think there are a lot of fair questions that can be asked, that should be asked. And a lot of them, there are no answers for.
Right.
And as you said, there are a lot of answers, different answers. And I've read a couple books and biographies of him. And again, I agree with you. There is no one common thread. There seems to be a lot of deviation in the official narrative as it applies to him.
Yeah. And then where you do find the common threads, it's that again, he was not considered really gifted in terms of the skill set that would be required to be even just a garden variety architect. This one quote here I have from a book: his fellow porcelainian club members did not spot him from the first as a future architect. His nickname, by the way, was Nothing to Wear, because he was a dandy and he was always he spent a lot of money on, as a rich kid in Harvard, on fine clothes. And now I'm looking at that, it kind of stuck with me, like Nothing to Wear, what an odd name. And then I thought of the Emperor's New Clothes. Well, maybe that's actually a nod to the hidden history side of this. Another book talked about there is an insufficiency about his work in the 1960s, which has nothing to do with his gifts or resources or ambitions. It goes on and on. So where there are threads in common throughout all these resources, it oftentimes points to uncomfortable truths that they can't get around, they can't avoid. But then they try to make sense out of it. He's referred to as inarticulate in another book. Incongruous. He struggled with incongruous forms and materials. Oh, this is a good one too, because he's the father of American Romanesque architecture. He never even saw, according to official narrative, he never even saw a Romanesque building in person until very late in his career. So when he had designed the Trinity building, the Trinity Church, which I've talked about in previous videos, it was said that it wasn't until another 10 years later that he saw any Romanesque buildings other than in photographs.
Yeah.
It's just not how it works.
And yeah, and then his relationship with Olmsted is intriguing to me as well. And
they were neighbors.
Yeah, and I think they were neighbors both on Staten Island and in Brookline, Massachusetts, I believe.
Were they neighbors in Staten Island as well?
Yeah, I believe that's where they met.
So in Brookline, they were back to their houses were back. They shared the same yard.
Right.
And Brookline was said it was the playground of the uber wealthy.
Oh, yes. Yes. The Boston Brahmins, which are the blue blood. Anyone who's anyone is a member of the Boston Brahmins, and they're actually still in existence. It's almost like a secret society kind of thing, but it's a very rich organization, and there's still people. Some of them are elected officials that are members of this group, and I believe Richardson may have married into his wife may have been a member of the Boston Brahmins. But I find that relationship with Olmsted interesting. And then there was Calvert Vaux, who was also a landscape architect. And Vaux and Olmsted were partners. And then today I was just reading about Calvert Vaux, Vaux. He ended up dying suspiciously, fell off a pier in New York. And there's a few mentions that there was some foul play. But Calvert Vaux and Olmsted and Richardson had a lot to do with Buffalo, New York, a lot of the buildings in Buffalo. And I think there was a sanitarium they built there, amazing, a beautiful park. But Calvert Vaux, it looks like he got the raw end of the deal. So there's some interesting, intriguing mysteries around these guys. And then I think you had showed a photo of HH Richardson in his robe, with his hand in his pocket. I think there's only maybe like 4 or 5 pictures of this guy.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, there's a Glesner house. I'm sure you've heard of the Glesner house. I think it's in Chicago.
Yep.
He designed it, and his portrait hangs to this day in that house. But the deal was, and I don't remember the artist that actually painted it, but the deal was if H.H. Richardson at the time had no money, and we're talking the 1880s, he was pretty much destitute. And he said, if you paint this, I'll design a house for you. And that was how that worked out. So for this painter, he ended up designing a house, and that was the deal. But not a lot of pictures of him. That one where he's kind of sitting there in his magician's robe.
Right.
Yeah.
It is kind of like magician's robe. You're right.
Yeah. So there's a lot of again, I don't want to damage this man's legacy. If he honestly did everything he did, congratulations. But I think we have the right to ask questions. And I think they're pretty legitimate questions or legitimate inquiries. And again, when you apply the trivium to this stuff and you look at these buildings, it's certainly within our right to ask the who, what, when, where, why, and especially the how. And it doesn't make sense to me that the official story, whatever it is believable.
Mm-hmm.
Without these answers, without somebody telling me how.
Yeah. And I think any good investigation, I think it's strengthened by trying to prove yourself wrong.
Yes. Yes.
And I've been approaching it that way. And I read these books and I immerse myself in. I'm like, well, this makes sense. And who am I to question? This book was written in 1888. I wasn't there, but then you read, something else that was written in 1886 and it's, totally contradicts the plot points. And it's like, well, somebody's making something up. And so now what do I believe? And then you have to go back to your own lying eyes and compare that. And by comparison, it just does not, over and over and over again, it doesn't add up. And, again, it's like, it almost hurts to do this, to go through this process.
It does.
Because
It
on the
does.
one hand, this is, it's not quite a sacred cow, but it was, not quite an idol, but, I really, really looked up to this guy, this amazing titan of an architect. And again, yeah, there's three. There's Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, and the first was Richardson. And to just start, pulling one leg out of a three-legged stool, it's like, well, what, and that's the other part that kind of pains me. It's like, what are we left with? And we're left with uncertainty and mystery and discomfort and everything. It's like, oh, but that's okay. We can sit with it. And, times are changing so quickly right now. Events are happening so fast. And it really does feel like we're living in a great unfolding.
Yes. Agreed.
And this great, I think, in some regards, awakening that's taking place. And if we've been hoodwinked for the last 150 years or so because of this most recent iteration of civilization, it's like, okay, put on our big boy pants and take a deep breath and look around. And so we don't have all the answers and we don't claim to, but we sure do have some good questions. I think that's a good place to start.
And I know this is it's a very microscopic in the realm of everything. HH Richardson is just one minor piece to, but if they're lying about that or they're making things up about that, what else are they not telling us? So, I've kind of honed in on him and I've honed in on this particular building in Albany. I've looked at a lot of other buildings that he's done. And it speaks to the bigger picture. So yeah, okay, it's an architect who maybe got more credit than he should have. However, it's more than that, because I mean, there are schools of architecture that this man is considered a god.
Right.
And people like yourself looked up to him. And I'm not asking to, again, I'm not trying to destroy his legacy, but I certainly would like to know more. And I think it's fair to ask the question that, again, that how keeps coming up. How in God's name did they build this without modern technology, without hydraulics? I mean, you're telling me we use derricks to lift these giant slabs. It's just logistically an incredible feat. And if it was, again, like you said, these people should be honored. There should be a hall of fame of sculptors and builders for what they've done, because
again, it should be steeped in our culture and our sense of ourselves. If all this is true, that it's built in everything was built in 1889 and 1890, it should be in our Hollywood movies, it should be in our literature, it should be in our story. Like, think of all of the movies that are about war and death and destruction and tearing down and resetting. Where is the epic monumental films that are based on how we put all this together? I'd go see it.
I mean, if you in Boston, Boston's 80 miles from where I live. And obviously Boston is steeped in beautiful architecture. And no one really talked. I've never heard of the Trinity Church until maybe 10 years ago. Never heard of it. You hear of the John Hancock building, which is a brutalist, ugly building that's just, it's just a big rectangle. And then the Prudential building is nothing really to look at. But, the biggest piece of architecture anybody talks about in Boston is the big monster in Fenway Park. Right. And like, are you kidding me? A big wall. That's the most storied piece of structure in Boston. So yeah, there's just we have this beauty around us that
Yeah.
should be honored and venerated, and we just drive by it as though it's always been there. And yeah, it's just there. And it's, my God, take the time to take a look and appreciate what went into that, and whoever did it. It's astonishing to me, and it's become a passion of mine where I've never, if you told me 10 years ago I'd be into architecture the way I am now, I wouldn't have believed it.
Hmm.
But it tells a story, and it's more than just a
Right.
building. And when, I think you had mentioned it, but when I went to Albany, you smell, you feel, you touch, you see, you take it in all senses. And again, like I said, with a criminal investigation, the investigator doesn't sit at his desk and remotely read about the crime or figure a way out to, you have to go and see, collect the evidence. You have to view, you have to interview people before you can write a story about what took place. And right now, with these buildings and these structures and HH Richardson, the only thing I can rely on is hearsay and what the official narrative is. And I have a hard time accepting it without asking further questions. And again, Matthew, I don't think we're going to get answers to those questions, but it sure as hell is fun, at least digging into it.
Yeah, it's great, man. This has been a great conversation, Lou. I
Yep.
really appreciate putting this slideshow together, and I hope that this is the first of many such conversations, and would continue this exploration. Of course, I'm, starting a new phase of my life tomorrow morning, and it was really important for me to get this in before I, began my treatment, because I just, I don't know what it's going to be like. I might just be out of the loop for the next 6 months. And if so, then, wonderful. This will be here as a reference point that I can return to. And in the meantime, I'm going to keep reading the books. Even if it's from my bed, I might try to avoid the computers and the Wi-Fi for a little while. I just, get on the healing path here. And
Yes.
but we've loosened the mayonnaise jar on the legacy of HH Richardson, and I'm really looking forward to continuing it. Yeah, and there's 80 buildings to choose from, so we're just scratching the surface with this one, exquisite and monumental as it is. So, Lou, thank you very much for
Thank you.
joining me and for having this conversation.
And Matthew, I wish you the best of luck and Godspeed, good luck. And I'm here if you need me out here in the East Coast, and I'll probably harass you with some pictures of the next building I go to. But I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, please do, man.
Yeah.
I'd love to get up to Boston and or Albany and check these things out myself. I'm from New Jersey and I've got family there still, and I'm way overdue a trip. I've got
Well,
some new nieces and nephews to go visit, so I'll let you know. We'll be in touch.
all right, brother.
Okay, Lou.
All right.
Yeah, till next time.
Okay. Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you so much.